right, I think we have our technical issues sorted out. So in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and start the session. It's my pleasure to introduce Julie Hagy-Hancock. Julie is a special education consultant and child advocate for families in Boulder and Denver and surrounding Colorado. She has a BA in communication studies, mediation training, and a master's in special education. Julie has spent the last 12 years specializing in advocacy, tutoring, behavior intervention, recreation, and eligibility for students with special needs. She's been awarded numerous grants to conduct research on best practice methods for working with students with special needs. She's shared her expertise and research methods in local and national conferences. Her research-based strategies have been implemented in schools across the country. Additionally, she's taught future special education teachers as a university adjunct faculty member. As a former special education teacher, Julie is able to advocate for students' needs, drawing from both the professional advocate and the classroom perspective. Welcome, Julie. I'm going to sit here and actually take notes, too.
Like the introduction said, I do advocacy work, and that started, I got my master's in special education, and my first year of teaching, the principal of the school came to me with a stack of IEPs, and she said to me, we don't have the funds and we don't have the room for all the kids that we have in special education. We need to get these kids out. So that really kind of determined my career path, and I realized that parents needed a voice of expertise with them at these meetings while they advocated for the best interest of their child through this really legally jargoned, complex process that the IEP is. So that's the work that I do on a daily basis. And I want to say before I launch into this also that most of what I will be talking about is federal law, but I am Colorado-based. Each state has their own interpretation of federal law. So at some points, and I'll try to delineate when I'm talking about Colorado specifics, at some points I'll be talking about some specifics to Colorado law. So I wanted to put that out there. And yes, please stop me as I go and ask some questions. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk through. We're going to look at the process and components of the IEP. We're going to look at how to effectively build and maintain supports within the document for your children, and then just about some advocacy and action planning for moving forward. Okay, I'm going to skip this one. So here are the recognized categories of disability under federal law, and I highlighted the two that are probably most relevant to your children. Developmental delay replaced the previous preschool category, so if you're new to the IEP world, developmental delay may be a category that your child's team considers as far as IEP eligibility. The significant thing to know about that particular category is that it only lasts until the age of 8. And it's supposed to be for a child who there's some delays going on, but the team's not quite sure what to attribute those delays to. So it's probably more appropriate that you ask the team, and I'm going to say that a lot, you initiate, because that's the way it goes. Knowledge is power in this process, and I think a lot of parents kind of wait for the school to come to them and initiate these pieces or these conversations, but you as a parent have the right to and have the knowledge to initiate these conversations yourself. So one of the conversations that you might initiate is considering other health impairment as the appropriate category of eligibility for your student. Other health impairment, that category is for students who show limited strength, vitality, or alertness. So those are the three key terms to know for that category of eligibility: strength, vitality, or alertness. So there has to be a significant impact in one of those three areas in order to qualify for an IEP. An IEP gives you that special education piece. It also makes the team And when I say team, you're a part of that team. So you are very much a part of this process. It also gives accountability to your team to set goals for your student in areas of identified need and to make progress in those areas. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, about measuring that progress. Is the 504 relevant to anyone here? Okay, so you probably heard the term 504, and that's a protection. So we're talking about an IEP, which comes from educational law. A 504 comes from American Disabilities Act, and it is a civil rights law, and that's the access piece. So it's a misconception that a student who's on an IEP also needs a 504. It's good to know that a student who is on an IEP is automatically protected by that 504, those 504 protections, that civil law component. And the 504 piece of the IEP is the accommodations piece. So that is what in this document and what in this school environment or home environment or hospital environment, whatever it may be, is going to let my child access education. Okay. And another piece to know about an IEP is that it serves students from 3 to 21 years old. Any questions about that eligibility piece? Okay. So I wanted to take you through components of an IEP. This is consistent across states, so no matter where you are, your team has to consider and document these pieces. So present levels is where is your student right now? What are they able to do? What are they not able to do at this point in time? Present levels, you don't have to depend on your school team to compile and collect all that data. You can come in with your private reports. So maybe you have a private OT or a PT. You can bring those reports into the school. And oftentimes that's more thorough, at least in Colorado, that's more thorough documentation than they have available to them. So I would highly suggest, unless it's going to negatively impact services at the school. So if the school's seeing a greater need and you want those services, you might not provide it. But I would highly suggest giving outside provider reports to your team for consideration in the IEP process. And you typically want to do that a month to 2 weeks before you're having the actual IEP meeting. That way it ensures that that data is actually getting incorporated into the report itself, and your team can use that, your team including you, can use that to set baselines, so that measurement piece for the goals that they are setting. And when I'm talking about providing private or independent testing to a school, they have the obligation to consider it. They don't have to accept it. So 99 out of 100 times that I'm at meetings, schools are very happy to have that information and integrate it. But what the law says is that they have to consider it. They don't necessarily have to accept it. So they can do their own measures, and they have the right to do their own measures, and take that as kind of the level and the baseline to set your child's IEP goals and services off of. And we'll talk a little bit later about if you have a disagreement with the team, what you can do about that. Impact of disability is another section of the IEP that's really important and is often gone through hurriedly. This is where you as a parent want to slow the team down. So when you get to the impact of disability section of your IEP, you want to put into writing all the ways that Dravet affects your child in the education setting. And you'll hear me say over and over education instead of school. So education is a broader term, and education is actually what IDEA, the law that gives us the IEP document, says. So education can mean, what does homework look like, or what does home look like? It's a broader term. So you want to make sure that you have that lens going into the meeting, that you're not just focused on this classroom time, right? So here you want to, this impact and disability sets up all the requests that you as a parent are going to make later, as far as service delivery goes, as far as goals go. So you want to make sure that you have a lot of impact here, and it states exactly what your students' needs are. The next section I want to touch on is the parent student input section. I see this section blank in IEPs all the time, and that is a violation of federal law. This is a really, really important section of the IEP. This is the one place where you directly have your voice in the document. You can say whatever you want to say. A lot of teams will have, at your IEP meeting, somebody will take notes and kind of like scribble some things into there as you talk. Another way that I have parents prep, and I always prep for this section, so go in with some key things that you want the team to record in that section. And this is a good place to kind of set up some disagreement too, right? If you don't just disagree with what you know the school is going to propose, you set that up in the parent-student input section. Something else I was going to say about that. Oh, another way that I have parents prep for that is to write out a couple paragraphs, right? Because these meetings are highly stressful, or can be highly stressful environments with a lot of professionals using a lot of jargon, and it's easy to forget what you went in wanting to say. So it's very appropriate to, at this meeting, read a script, provide the team with a draft copy and say, I want you to input this into the document. So whatever way works for you, this is your one section to have exactly what you want into the IEP. Consideration of special factors. We'll talk about that in a minute. Related factors or related services. Those are the things that help your student access education. I mentioned like occupational therapy or physical therapy, speech and language, things like that. Also transportation goes in here. We'll touch on that in a little bit. Extended school year. That is built into, again, across states. This is built to help support students in maintaining progress on their IEP goals during the summer. Just because parents have mixed feelings about ESY, its appropriateness and its benefit, and I have seen, even in Colorado, district to district, the ESY programs vary greatly. So as a part of your child's IEP meeting, when you get to this section, questions you might want to ask are, who delivers ESY? How are the IEP goals, communicated? Are related service providers going to be available? How are the accommodations that my child has going to be carried out? Lots of times they're in different settings or different schools. I think a good thing to know is that even if your child qualifies for extended school year, ESY, you don't have to take the school district up on it, right? So you're not locking in at that point in time and qualifying your child for ESY that they're going, right? So you're just saying, yep, my child is eligible, and then you as a family can make an informed decision and determination whether or not you want to take part in that extended school year or go to the beach or whatever it might be instead. Any questions about that piece? Okay. Yes.
So something that they, I live in North Carolina, but that was an issue that we've had the past 2 years with my son is continuing things over the summer.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's something that we wanted to do.
Right.
And the school has said, well, that's not an option unless you get private services like therapy services to come out with a different company. Is that something that they're supposed to?
Absolutely.
So,
if he qualifies. So as you go through the IEP process with your team, they have to legally stop and consider extended school year. So if they're just giving you a blanket no, which I see all the time, that your child doesn't qualify, what you want to point back is to say, give me the data points to support this, right? And I think one of the most powerful things, and I'm jumping all over the place, but one of the most powerful things that you can do as a parent is get those progress reports from your school. And so what I see is a student's progress report will say making progress, period, right? So if you get something like that, then you send it back. You say, I'm not accepting this as a progress report. You put that in writing, and you say, give me some data points to support this conclusion. And then those data points are then what you use to qualify a student for ESY. Specifically, you're looking at data points over a time of period that a child wasn't receiving education. So maybe you take a data point before winter recess and then afterwards. So you're looking for that regression piece, and as a parent, your standpoint is that in order to maintain skills, that they have to have that extended school year component. You have this conversation, the school still disagrees with you. A good strategy is to say, okay, we're in disagreement. I'm asking you to write that in the prior written notice. Really important piece of the IEP document. It's called a PWN, or a prior written notice. You get that after the meeting. I know it sounds like you should get it before, but that logs what the school is agreeing to do, what they're disagreeing to do, and what you've asked for. So perfect place to set up your mediation or your due process complaint. But often it doesn't even get there. If you ask a school to write something in the prior written notice, it should go off in their brains. Like there's some disagreement here. Let's resolve it here, instead of this parent potentially taking it to the next level. Yes. 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 So I think one of the best things that you can do as a parent or a guardian is to pace this meeting, right? Like they'll come in, they'll give you a 45-minute time slot. You pace it. You say, you have a disagreement, stop. We need this written into the prior written notice. You wait till they type it out. A lot of times you can write your school a couple days in advance and say, I want this projected. I want to do this in real time. And you sit there and you wait till they type out that line. And then if you get to the end of 45 minutes, you haven't completed your IEP, you call a continuation. And they'll start scheduling you for an hour and a half, right? Going forward. Transition plan, I'm going to skip over that one. But basically, I'm not going to skip over. I'm going to go quickly through it. Transition plan is transitioning your child out of high school into secondary, next pieces of education or job training or community living. And that's real specific to your child's needs and desires. I guess what I say as far as like a tip in that section is you always want to broadly include higher education in there. Because what you don't want to see is your child limited, right, in scope. You always want that further education piece, that broad access to education in your school's lens. So your kid will keep getting science and social studies and English and whatnot. So whether that's your family's plan or not, you want that to be a component of the transition plan. And I'm going to spend some time on this, I guess. Another piece of the transition plan is a lot of times schools will talk about these community linkages that they'll make or connect you with for your child. Invite those people to the meeting. Make sure that those people are there to speak for their programming at the meeting. Don't just hear about it from the school team, because in my experience, I have found the school team has kind of limited knowledge, or a lot of school teams do, on what exact services that those community linkages can provide. So this is a little pre-meeting prep, and say, what linkages are you thinking about suggesting for our family? And okay, great, got the names. Then you as a parent or through your case manager, you set up for those people to be there and be a part of the actual IEP meeting. Okay, accommodations and modifications. Yes. Yes.
You may cover this in different slides, so that's fine. We've actually been haggling back and forth with the school district on a transition plan that's been part of the IEP that's been toward his nursing service.
Okay.
And they're basically pushing him out of nursing services. And they want a transition plan. Anyway, long story short, we went back and forth with them. It wasn't until several meetings and about to go see a lawyer that they said, well, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to sign .p.
Are you?
What?
Are you in Colorado?
Yeah, Virginia.
I'm from Virginia.
I would also let everyone know know that they also didn't tell us that we could have saved a lot of heartache and a lot of emotion. They basically said, okay, in so many months we're basically taking away this nurse. If you do not agree, they go back to whatever the prior agreed upon IEP is.
Not necessarily.
And so I would at least push the envelope with that. Then they can take you to mediation, they can take you to due process, but they fall back on that prior year agreed upon. They actually, the district said they've got some people in prior agreements that have been in that way, that have basically been non-signed for a few years. So that's how we're talking about a transition plan. I know what that is, but that's something we're dealing with right now. A partial signature versus a full signature. We actually are transitioning to a one-on-one aid.
Okay.
We're going to build a transition plan to see how it goes. But that is something that we have learned through that process that was new to us.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So that's a state-to-state difference as well. Here in Colorado, you never sign an IEP. I know a lot of states on the East Coast, like you approve it or you disapprove it or you reject certain sections, right? In Colorado, so you would deal with that through the placement too instead of the transition plan. So that's a different state-by-state piece, but yeah, very good to know.
Just out of curiosity,
Mhm.
this is something to put out there. You can ask your pediatrician or your doctor to attend your IEPs as well.
I think one of the most powerful, so oftentimes,
Yes. My daughter has attended some of her patients' IEPs. Absolutely.
oftentimes,
In Michigan, so. Okay, there you go. We'll talk later.
oftentimes you can take a pediatrician, or if you're like butting heads with the school team and you reach out to your pediatrician or someone who's done private testing, like I do this all the time. I write out the accommodations in school language and then I send it back to the pediatrician and say, can you sign off on this? And then having that MD or that PhD or whoever sign off on it, it goes right into the IEP. So that is a really good strategy, or phone in, or, you know, I think too, and I'm skipping all around. I really, parents have more knowledge and more power in this process than they think they do. At these tables, which can be like 9 or 14 people, they're intimidating. I want you to know that you are probably the second or if not the most informed person at that meeting about the process. There's that special ed teacher who knows what the process is, but otherwise those people are just participants, right? For the most part. They know their specialty area, but as far as the in and outs of the IEP and what's legal and what's not legal, you're and about your child's, you know, area of need specifically, you're the most informed person there. So your voice is so important. If you go in a meeting and you're stopping them and asking them to document a sentence in a prior written notice, right? They're going to stop and listen. They're going to know that you know what you're talking about. So go in there with confidence. Accommodations and modifications. So the difference is, and these are sometimes lumped together depending on state, but accommodations are how we get to education. Modifications are what we learn. So accommodations, how we learn, modifications, what we learn. Accommodations could be darkened lighting, right? That gives a child access to learning. Modifications would mean maybe, you know, like a reduction in, instead of reading, you know, 3 pages, you're reading a paragraph. So actually changing the content is what a modification is. Goals. Any questions about accommodations, modifications? Again, that's an area state by state that can look very different. In Colorado, you're not supposed to, according to Colorado law, you're not supposed to receive modifications, so change of content, unless your child is qualifying under an intellectual disability. And that's very Colorado specific. I don't agree with it. Most states, you can qualify for modifications based upon needs. But again, something to talk to with your team about modifications. I would caution you to be specific in that wording. You don't want the bar lowered so far that your student doesn't have high expectations. So be specific with the team about exactly how and what they're going to modify. Goals are, again, refer back to that impact of disability statement and are set in the areas that your child needs support in special education or related services. And I'm going to go quickly through that because I have another slide on that. Service delivery, you want this section to be as specific as possible. You want it to list who's going to be delivering those services, where they're going to be delivered. When I say where, I mean, are they going to be in small group, large group, special education classroom, general education classroom? Is it going to be co-taught, special education teacher and a general education teacher? So you want as specific as possible. Maybe it's even asking for a specific reading, a school of reading. So you want the methodology written into there. In Colorado, and I know, again, this is a state-to-state difference, there's a grid where it lists out specifically minutes. And then above that, which is often skipped, should be a narrative that writes out exactly the interpretation of how those minutes are going to be utilized. And again, that's an accountability measure. So if you walk into the school and your child's supposed to be in gen ed, but you have a service delivery statement saying, okay, during science time, they're supposed to be, in gen ed, and here I see them in special education, then that gives you more leeway to go in and make some change in the IEP if you have that specific language in there. Another thing that I would, as a parent, try to obtain is both direct and indirect minutes in the service delivery section. So direct minutes are the minutes that the special education teacher or related service providers are actually spending with your child. Indirect minutes are very important. Those are the minutes that your child's case manager, so their special education teacher or their related service providers, are taking time to train the rest of the staff in what they're working with your child on. So it would be great if your OT has 15 minutes a week or a month or whatever to teach the rest of the team who's going to be seeing your child every day, every minute, to use those skills that they're working on in that therapeutic setting. We see that goals are reached much more quickly when we have that kind of collaboration. And the way that you as a parent try to influence that collaboration is through the request for indirect service minutes. And you can ask for that for everybody on your child's team. So strategically, what I would suggest you as a parent or guardian do is set your direct minutes first, right? You don't want to compromise most of the time direct minutes for indirect minutes. So you go through, you get each service provider. Again, you're taking the reins here. You're leading this discussion. You set your direct minutes, and then you come back and you say, okay, I would like to hear what each of you is proposing for indirect minutes to collaborate with the rest of the team on these skills that we've identified. Okay, then your IEP has to include, your child's IEP has to include a discussion of the least restrictive environment. And I know that's a term, that the LRE, that you've all heard. And that is back to that education law, IDEA. It says that a child has to be educated with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent possible. So meaning gen ed, right? That they're in the gen ed classroom as much as possible. So the team has to consider two possibilities and choose one of those possibilities. Again, a very appropriate place for your voice and what that should look like with the team. The rest of the team disagrees with you, write it in the prior written notice, right? Stop them and ask them to write it in the prior written notice. And then what that prior written notice gives you is some documentation should you need to hire an attorney, or if you didn't bring an advocate to the meeting with you, should you need to go to your advocate, you have a basis for that disagreement. And it doesn't have to be a negative process forward, right? But it gives you a point for that negotiation to happen. And we talked about the prior written notice already. Okay. Related services, I actually changed this slide on the one. So related services, and you can Google this. So IDEA specifies a broad range of related services that your child is able to access. Oftentimes when you go into these meetings, it's a really limited menu of what your child might be able to access. So my suggestion to you is when you get what's called a consent to evaluate / PWN, prior written notice consent to evaluate, what the school does is they have to list the areas that they intend to evaluate. So oftentimes you'll see things like cognitive, academic, fine motor maybe. You, before signing that consent to evaluate, and this is across states, they have to give you this consent to evaluate. You'll get it the first time your child is considered for eligibility for special education. You'll get it every 3 years when they have their triennial. Lots of parents just sign that, right? They start the process. This is a really important time to make sure that all areas of suspected, that's what it's called, suspected need are identified in writing. So if you think your child might need audiology or assistive or augmentative communication support, this is your point to document and start that process and the consent to evaluate. So if you get a consent to evaluate that just says cognitive and academic, take it back to the team and say, and I'm saying say, but write, put it in writing. I also suspect that my child may qualify for special or related services in these following areas, and you list them out. So what that does is it triggers evaluations in each of those areas and makes the team consider potentially your child receiving services in those areas. Or you could go back and say, I want all these areas evaluated, and the team could say, no, we don't agree. And then you go back and forth. But you have it in writing, and most of the time the team will move forward with those evaluations if there is a suspected disability. Okay. And I keep saying everything in writing. I literally mean that, not email. So if you are sending an email, you're also putting that request in writing. You're hand delivering it. You're dating it. You're asking for the school to retain it in your child's permanent file. Emails get lost all the time. And then you as a parent also have the ability to anytime go sit down and do a review of your child's file, which is oftentimes a really powerful thing. You can see what the school's included in there, what they've not included. So you have a letter from your, pediatrician. Is it in there? It should be, right? Anything that you're asking to be included in that file should be in that file ongoing. Let's see what I want to prioritize here. A lot of you all have probably seen this acronym before, building strong goals. Goals should be specific, so looking at one skill, they should be measurable. Again, you're looking for a data point. So when I say measurable, I'm looking for something like, Johnny will achieve X in 9 out of 10 trials. You're going to bump that number up, right? You don't want 2 out of 3 trials because you want to make sure that the team's doing it with fidelity. So every progress monitoring, they've checked for that 10 times, and you're getting a data point based upon that. Let's see. Action words, realistic, time limited. So realistic means you don't want them sky high, you don't want them too low. You want them based upon appropriate baselines. Time limited. So you're building this IEP document for a year's time. So that's what time limited should often be, is in a year's time, Johnny will have reached this goal. Another way to look at this time limited piece of a SMART goal is to build objectives in, right? So you could say, we want to make sure this goal is really obtainable. So by mid-year, and mid-year, I'm talking about mid-year in an IEP's life. So your IEP meeting could be in September, it could be in February. So by September, if I have my IEP meeting in September, by February, this is what my child is going to be able to do with those benchmark objectives if needed. Another great thing to know is that if you get those progress reports and appropriate progress, your take on that or the school's take on that, if appropriate progress is not being made, then call a meeting, right? I see this happen all the time. Parents get IEP or get progress reports back and no or insufficient progress is being made, and they wait till the next progress report. As soon as you get a progress report that says insufficient progress or if progress is not being made, you call a meeting. You better believe that the parents who are in there 3 or 4 times a year exercising their federal right to have these meetings, to have these conversations, those are the kids that are getting prioritized. Those are the kids who are getting their service delivery met. So again, you put in writing what your concern is, you call a meeting, and they have to convene or give you a very, very good reason not to. I've actually never called a meeting and had a team reject it. So again, you give your reasoning and you say you're calling a meeting, and you go in and you bump up service delivery or you change service delivery, or you ask for a different placement or a different methodology. It really opens a lot of doors for you. Okay. Pet peeve of mine is this loophole language. So you can have a really, really strong IEP, or you can have, or even, looking section by section, you can have some really strong accommodations for a child. And you'll see these little loophole kind of or caveats that are added into the document. This is often, parents will just, retain me to work with them on this part. It's just making sure this is a solid document. But you'll see, language like, as needed, added to accommodations. Well, who's making that determination? Who's making that call, right? So an accommodation is an accommodation. You don't want any of this language attached to accommodations or to goals. So be on the lookout for language, or even should instead of will. It makes a big difference. So he should be able to do this by May is very different than he will be able to do this by May. Or a thing that I often see is in IEPs is when a child requests it or is advocated by a child or a parent. That's inappropriate. These are accommodations, these are goals. This is what we've determined as a team. They have to be provided. I think I'm going to skip over this in interest of time. Maintaining documents. So you'll have your meeting every year. You'll have a triennial review every 3 years, unless something significant happens in your child's life. Then you can say, if something does, then you call this evaluation earlier. Say you need to consider an additional area of disability, then you can bump up that triennial meeting. It just has to be held every 3 years. And this is when they do the whole gamut of testing again. Again, a great time to, go to your service providers and have them write up the baselines, your private service providers, and have them write up, the current work they're doing with your student and where they see baselines at. Use it or lose it accommodations. So, sometimes I see pages of accommodations. You want accommodations to be appropriate for your child, so to really represent what they need to access education, but not so lengthy that nobody who's working with your child is ever going to remember what the accommodations are. As a parent too, I would suggest every couple months, 3 or 4 times a year, you send a card or Starbucks coupon to your staff and say, hey, I'm just reminding you of Jenny's accommodations, or here's a review, or before they start the school year even, I want to introduce you to my child. Here are their accommodations. Let me know if you have any questions. So you want to get those in front of your staff a couple times a year, because what can happen is that a teacher looks at the IEP hopefully before this school year, but may look at that IEP document once, especially the gen ed teachers, and you want this to be very current knowledge in their heads. And use it or lose it. If your student doesn't use an accommodation, then the team is going to ask to pull it the next year. So make sure that your student is accessing the accommodations in their IEP. Another just general tip is to use the word appropriate in meetings. I know that sounds like a nitpicky thing, but under federal law, public schools have no obligation to provide your student with best education. So when parents go in there and say, it's best for Jimmy to have this accommodation or to receive this service, or they don't have to honor that. what they have to honor is appropriate. FAPE, free and appropriate public education, is what kind of governs this IEP process. So you as a parent go in and you advocate from that point. This is what is appropriate given my student's current needs. This is what is appropriate for him or her to learn. I'm going to just kind of documenting agreements, disagreements. We talked about the prior written notice. If you go in and the team, you're in one of those 1 percentile situations where the team is rejecting your private reports, it doesn't end there. The team has to hand you your what's called your procedural safeguards at the beginning of each meeting. And those tell you what rights you have as a parent when in instances where you disagree. My experience, most of the time we can work it out through, that back and forth about the prior written notice or just within the meeting itself. If the team is rejecting your private service providers, you have the ability to request what's called an IEE, an independent education evaluation. It's an underutilized resource that's available to you. It's called an independent education evaluation. And what that says is you can say I disagree with all this testing, or you can say I disagree with these specific pieces. And you can ask or request for what's called that IEE. There's 2 ways to do it. You can have that done at private expense, go out and do it yourself. Or most commonly, what you ask is for an IEE at public expense. And that's asking for the school board or the school district to pay for that testing. And then they have to come back to the table and consider all that body of evidence they have to make determinations for the IEP. I think we talked about this, progress reports, teacher conferences, emails. Okay. Actually, I want to talk about something else real fast. Another underutilized resource is assistive technology and augmentative technology resources and teams. It's probably a good idea to get that team on board. You have the ability to, in writing, request that a technology evaluation for your child. And it could be real low tech, like a picture schedule might be appropriate for your child. It could be an augmentative communication device. It could be assistive technology, something that reads aloud to them. Triggering that evaluation means that somebody's trained, comes into your school and does that evaluation for your child. And I don't see enough parents take advantage of that resource. Once the team from the district conducts that evaluation, then it's part of that body of that IEP. And you can integrate it into services, you can integrate it into goals, you can integrate it into accommodations. So that's something that I would definitely explore with your team. You might need, sometimes it's a push to get that. And it may be that you as a parent go in and agree to trial at the school level and then come back in 6 months and, push it to the evaluation team. Often these teams are kind of booked out, so you want to do this in writing in advance. But yeah, an underutilized resource. I'm going to go just over a couple meeting tips. You can read through these, and I'll kind of talk through a couple of them. But you want to ask to see the results of testing prior to the meeting. So I don't go into meetings typically with parents unless I have a copy of that evaluation report in front of me in advance. And you shouldn't either. It's too much to wade through those data points and, 10 to 20 pages of documentation and make informed decisions. So you want to put in writing prior to your child's scheduled IEP meeting that you want this, I would say at the minimum, 72 hours in advance. You can also you can use this strategy for your annual meeting as well, right? So you can ask for a copy of the school's drafted IEP in advance. And this just gives you time to go in from an equally informed standpoint, and you can go in with your questions and your comments kind of organized already and your disagreements. I've had schools who've refused to that. I've gone in with families, we picked up the evaluation report, said, thanks, we just got it. Let's schedule a time to sit down now, right? So you just push out the meeting. I feel that this is a very important part of your ability to participate to the full extent in your child's educational planning. And like I said earlier, that continuation piece, a very viable option. If you don't get through all the pieces that you need to, you call a continuation. And you have that documented in the prior written notice. Another thing that I can tell you to do is to not feel the pressure to finalize that IEP on the spot. There's nothing that says that you have to finalize that IEP during the meeting. I think one of the most powerful things you can do as a parent is take it as a draft and then, sit on it, talk about it, talk to an advocate, talk to family, talk to other families who have IEPs, and then you go back and you finalize it when you're ready and you're informed, and you make tweaks with the team. You can request specific staff members to be a part of the team. So if you have kind of a dud teacher this year, but you had an excellent teacher last year, bring them back into the team to give that input. Really important too is if your annual meeting is scheduled at the beginning of the year and your teacher hasn't had the opportunity to get to know your child, bring in that teacher from last year so that there's not that gap in learning about the child. Use model for teachers and staff at the meetings. Use person first language. I think it's one of the most powerful things that we can do. So, you have a child with Dravet. You don't have a Dravet child. You don't have a Down syndrome child. You have a child with Down syndrome. Model that language in every interaction you have with everybody at the school, just in life, right? Let's see. We talked about calling meetings early and often. If they need training, if teachers need any specific training to teach your child, that's something that can go into the IEP. Don't just let them write it as we will get training. Date that training by X date. And so what I typically like parents to have in there is we find out when the teachers are back before the school year, and we say by X day, like in that 2-week frame, like everybody who's working with my child will have this training. And again, that goes into the prior written notice. Let's see. I think that any questions about meetings and navigating meetings? Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah, so you're just, so it would be an augmentative technology referral. And if they're not as a team willing to do it, so collaboratively as a team, if they're not willing to move forward with that, again, put it in writing, ask for it to be in the file. We're making a referral because anybody can make the referral. We're making a referral for an augmentative communication evaluation. They're called different names like SWAC or AT team, like district to district and state to state. They're called different things, but that resource is available. So if you use the term assistive technology or augmentative technology, they'll know what you're getting at. So this is just a list of, so my role is to take attorneys out of the equation so that it's not adversarial and that at the end of the day, kids win and everybody at that meeting feels like that they've collaborated and that they don't have an attorney breathing down their back, but that they are being held accountable for meeting a student's needs. So oftentimes bringing an advocate to a meeting, if they have a good, strong knowledge of the law, is could be a more appropriate choice than bringing an attorney into a meeting. I've been with families who bring myself and an attorney into a meeting, and what I can tell you is the vibe is totally different. Nobody talks. Right? Nobody talks. So you don't get a true reflection of where your child is. It's this fine line that you as a parent play, right? Because you're informing your team. So when I got my master's in special education, those that were in the cohort with me, I was in a fellowship program, who were getting their master's in special education, in general education. They had one class through their whole master program in working with kids with special needs. One class. So, that's dyslexia, that's Down syndrome, that's everything. So one of the most important things that you can do is inform your team, whether it's taking pamphlets, using that time, using your parents' input to inform them, about how to work with your child. I forgot where I was going with that. Did I answer? Yeah. Let's see. And then just some ending thoughts here. Oftentimes you'll get documents within an IEP meeting that look like a menu. Here's what you have to choose from. I want you to know that you can think broadly and you can think outside of that. That an IEP is truly designed to be individualized and meet your child's needs. So if you get a checklist of accommodations that you want, you're not limited to that. You can suggest to the team anything that's appropriate for your child. And often that's things you're doing at home that need to be carried over into the school. So here is my website. I've spent a lot of time just putting articles and supports onto my website, so you can access some pieces about, or some articles about the pieces that we've talked about today on my website. And that's my contact information as well. And then I always like to end with some action pieces. So what I would like for everybody to do before we leave this room is to think about 2-2-2. So 2 action steps, 2 things you want to do with your child's IEP. So it might be sitting down and reviewing accommodations for loophole language. It may be looking to see if your child has indirect minutes as well as direct minutes. So 2 concrete, really specific things that you want to do for your child's IEP. And then I find the most effective way to make sure that those are put into place is to tell 2 people and to set 2 dates for these action pieces. So you all can take, and I think I'm way over my time, but if you'll just think of that as we end, and I'm happy to take any 1 or 2 questions until they run me out. If there's any lingering questions about the IEP process. Yes.
I didn't realize, and I'm assuming she had very little special ed training, but she hadn't read her IEP, was kind of shooing us out of the main classroom. So I was going to spend like the first half hour with her peers, and then move into special ed. Just not very welcoming and inclusive, and I'm assuming it's okay to invite them to our IEP meeting, because she never attended those, which I was surprised as well.
Yeah, by law, they have to have like 1 representative from Gen Ed. So there has to be 1 Gen Ed teacher there. So hopefully they have that person. But you're welcome to ask for them to invite her specifically, again, in writing. Yeah. And I mean, that document has to be enforced. That person doesn't get the option, so, yeah. Any other questions? Absolutely. I think a lot of it goes into that pre-year planning, and it may be that you're calling a meeting really early on in the year, or you're offering to go in those 2 weeks that teachers are there before school starts, to do a little training yourself from a parent perspective, because I find a lot of it is just fear or lack of knowledge, and, giving teachers, especially Gen Ed teachers, the tools to navigate that fear is often, one of the most powerful things you can do. So, yeah. Yes?
I just find that a lot of schools won't, at least in Michigan, they won't start your IEP until the actual school year is in session, so you can't do that 2 weeks prior to school.
You can if you get it in your prior written notice.
What?
You can if you get it in the prior written notice, documented that they will do a training. So maybe you're calling a meeting. I mean, it's all strategy, right? So maybe you're calling a meeting at the end of the year, and in that meeting, your goal for that meeting is to get them to write in the prior written notice by X date. We're having a training, and it's within that 2-week time frame before school starts.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So in Kentucky, preschool in the public school is not mandatory, or is actually not given unless there's some type of disability.
Right.
So our son is 3,
Mm-hmm.
but we want to go ahead and get into this preschool. It's half a day, morning or afternoon.
Right.
Do I still have these rights, even though he can't be counted truant because it's not considered like he's in school, he's still preschool. So do I still have these rights for the IEP?
Absolutely. 3 to 21. So they should have started. Did you have an
We do.
ISP?
Yeah.
Okay.
We met back in February, so we have these things that I didn't know what rights I have. because
All
he
of
wasn't,
these, yeah,
technically
right.
in school because he's not.
All of these. Mm-hmm. Yeah. As soon as you're on an IEP document, when you hit 3, all of these apply. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to advocate for getting advocates. We've used Julie in the past. There are free services that a lot of states offer, but I would compare a free service person versus a professional advocate as to someone telling you your child has a genetic mutation versus someone telling you you have a missense printing on your SCNH specific gene, right? It's a world of difference. And what you do when you have somebody, at least until you learn the ropes, is you do a lot of the work ahead of time. So by the time you get in the meeting, like she's been at a meeting with us and sat there quietly because we worked out everything ahead of time. They knew she was there. I mean, it might have been a fine meeting anyway, but we worked it out all ahead of time. So by the time you actually get to that meeting, it's almost like it's already set. So you already figured everything out. You don't have that antagonist.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are having any trouble, if you scramble the money to get a professional help you out, highly recommend.
Yeah. Thanks.
So in Colorado, is occupational therapy and physical therapy included in an IEP? What does that mean?
They are related services, which means, so back to that consent to evaluate, you need to make sure that your school team is evaluating for either broadly motor skills, which would mean both are fine and gross motor, and they are for access to education in that environment. So they're not going to be as broad as you're getting, in your home setting or with your private therapist, but they're going to work on accessing the school environment. So they'll be real specific to navigating school tasks. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
In our experience is it's nowhere near what you can get in a private or outside of school setting. It's pretty much like my motor, like kindergarten or right or age, but like nothing really beyond.
Well, then you keep.
Exactly.
My daughter barely qualifies for PT now, and she can't even run, but she can get to school. So they're like, I'm like, just give her that hour a week, But she can never get to school, and she can never get to classes.
And you want to be really sweet and ask these questions that you have that are setting you up for success later. Like when you're with your PT this year and you're setting a goal and you're worried that PT is going to be taken away from you in the future. This sounds like a great goal. Where do you go next? Like this really broad question. Where do you go next with PT services once a child's reached this goal? You listen, you write it down, you show up at the next year's IEP with that written down. We talked about this last year. This is where we said we were moving, and you hold them to that service delivery. And I'll stop after this. Another thing you'll routinely hear is like, that's the max we can give as a district. You never take that. Or that's what we give to kids with this disability. Nope. Again, back to that individualized piece. So oftentimes the OTPT are points that you really have to push hard for. Well, thanks for letting me chat today. I appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks for having me.